Hello, this is Roxon Liu from Oakland, California, with a video of a robotic tap right lower quadrant um, incisional hernia repair. As you can see, the peritoneum in this patient was very thin, and I'm going to show the dissection and the flap closure, which is what was interesting with this case. As you can see, the flap was fairly thin, but respectable and usable. The flap medially, caudally, and laterally was good, but in the cephalad portion, there was a part that was missing. And at the end of the case, it proved a little challenging to close. Um, and I thought this was a good video to share because there was a little tiny piece of peritoneum uh, dangling from the main flap that I was going to discard, but eventually it proved to be very important for my flap closure too. So I didn't have to do any unusual maneuvers to patch the defect. So here I'm working on the cephalad portion of the flap, and as I dissect further, you can see I reach scar, and the flap becomes more difficult to dissect. This was the only time where I lost a little bit of red blood cells. As you can see, the caudal aspect of the dissection was very easy. This is the usual plane we get into with transversus abdominis releases. And I was seeking to get a 5 centimeter overlap in all direction with this hernia, which is usually my typical amount of overlap. And as I'm dissecting in the cranial direction, you can see the flap starts getting a little bit more challenging to mobilize. And eventually I get to a point where there's really no peritoneum to mobilize, as there was a little gap there. So I went just a little bit more lateral and found a nice space between the peritoneum and the abdominal wall. And I eventually get into the pretransversalis fascia space. You can see the transversus abdominis muscle there against the ceiling. And so I had this little flap of peritoneum already mobilized, and I figure I'll just keep it, but disconnected. And the rest of this dissection then became a little bit more straightforward as long as I stayed in the pretransversalis fascia plane, this upper portion of the abdomen. You can see some scar tissue there. Her prior surgery was a open cholecystectomy and some other abdominal operations not related to this area. So in this case, actually right here, the hernia sac was not reducible as the rim of the defect was very scarred. So I wasn't even going to attempt to reduce a hernia sac. But that was one of the options for closing a flap that has a missing piece of peritoneum is to try to mobilize the sac. Either keep it attached to the peritoneal flap or mobilize it separately as a free flap. And here you can see I'm transitioning between the preperitoneal space caudally and the pretransversalis fascia space, the cephalad portion. And this part definitely you would consider it a transabdominal preperitoneal operation, whereas in the upper part you can call that a TARM, transabdominal retromuscular. But overall, I would categorize this surgery as a TAP, a transabdominal preperitoneal, even though this part I'm somewhat retromuscular. And here I'm just trying to find a plane that's somewhere between the peritoneum and the transverse abdominis muscle. And whether that's uh, between the transversalis fascia and the muscle or between the peritoneum and the muscle, it really doesn't matter in this case. It's just whichever plane is the easiest to develop. And so I kind of over dissected in the easy portion just to try to create a little bit more laxity on the flap. The colon that was attached to the peritoneum did kind of drag the flap a little bit, so it made it harder to pull its cephalad later during the fascial closure. So you can see I have more than enough overlap. So I did over dissect caudally and laterally. And I'm going to skip the part where I placed the mesh. I'm going to jump directly to the portion where the mesh was already placed. I put in 13 by 11 centimeter Pro Grip and secured it at a few points with some Velcros. And they're just making sure there's enough mobility so I can drag the peritoneal flap a little bit more medially when I close it, because I knew there was going to be a gap. And I was hoping that the extra mobilization would allow me to close the flap. So here I'm closing, and I have this little dangling piece of peritoneum. Normally I would disregard that, but for some reason today I felt like, well, maybe I will need it. So I kept it in place. And fortunately I did, because you'll see as I start closing the flap, I start becoming a little bit more precise in how I grab the flap. I really made sure I grab the upper edge of the flap. And you can see as I start grabbing the upper edge of the flap, it really stretches out, and it looked like a piece of tissue that would really help me with closing my peritoneal flap. So here, so this is a lesson in just respecting the peritoneum. Just preserve all the peritoneum that you have, and don't discard it or damage it until you know for sure that you don't need it. So you can see that little strip of peritoneum provided quite a bit of extra coverage. And even that little end piece, when you stretch it out, it covers quite a bit. And this is an 3O V-lock 180 suture that I'm using. So I maximize every little uh, square millimeter of that little piece of peritoneum. And then now the over dissection allows me to drag a little bit more peritoneum medially, so that now the entire flap can be closed. I did lower the pressure, abdominal pressure, and probably down to 7 or 9 at this point. I'm a little concerned that this could rip open once the patient wakes up, but she's pretty thin with a low BMI, and I didn't feel like this flap was going to be under too much tension when she wakes up. So the rest of the closure was pretty straightforward. The upper flap was very thin, so I did make sure when I pulled in line with the defect, so I wouldn't tear the peritoneum of the upper flap. One thing I do quite often is if there's a little bit of tension, I do a few throws before I pull the suture through. This way the tension gets distributed across the entire flap rather than just at one point. And that's it. Thank you for watching.